everyone. I welcome you to the CEC lecture series. I am Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. And in this lecture, we are going to continue our discussion on an important text by an American feminist scholar, that is Kimberly Crenshaw. And the essay in discussion is Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. Now, this is a 1989 essay, which means that it's a late 20th century intervention that we are talking about, right? And in the previous lecture, we had discussed that how Crenshaw, in this essay, makes a seminal contribution through a discussion of the concept of intersectionality, right? We looked at different aspects of intersectionality that she talks about in the initial parts of the essay. The next thing that we go on to say is that while looking at the question of black women and the idea of discrimination vis-a-vis their unique subject position, what she says is that the existing markers of discrimination or the existing standards by which discrimination is defined, those standards are essentially based on some kind of a privilege, right? That's the point that Crenshaw makes. Let's look at this quote in this regard from the essay. She says, and I quote, "The paradigm of sex discrimination tends to be based on the experiences of white women. The model of race discrimination tends to be based on the experiences of the most privileged blacks," unquote. Now, in this quotation, you will see that the question of privilege is then unpacked. What do we mean by, or what does she mean by privilege? She means that in discussions of women's issues, there is a kind of an assumption. What is that assumption? That the experience of a woman is the experience of a white woman. That's a kind of a given fact, which is assumed by these theories that seek to unpack the idea of discrimination, right? So, woman's question then, according to Crenshaw, is essentially a white woman's question. And in the anti-racist discourse, the understanding of discrimination over there is based on the privileged blacks, right? Not any blacks, but those blacks who have some kind of a privilege. It is their subject position then which forms the basis for these markers of discrimination to then come up with situations that they say can be categorized as instances of subjugation or this kind of a bias, right? So that's the point that she makes vis-a-vis privilege. Privilege as in the white woman, privilege as in the privileged upper class blacks, okay? Now, from here, we see then that how she offers a critique of how black women are disadvantaged then in the anti-discrimination law in the US. Now, in the essay, she actually, goes at length. Now, as I was, if you remember in the previous lecture, as I was telling you that she, Crenshaw is very, very closely associated with law. She's part of the law departments in the US, right? So even in this essay, you will notice that this theoretical framework that she talks about, she explains it in, with reference to a lot of court judgments that were advanced in the US, okay? Now, I'm not going to go into a detailed discussion of those, but she actually offers a critique through these references of how black women are disadvantaged in these anti-discrimination law in the US, and how the law itself fails to factor in the essential questions of black women, right? Now let's look at this quote from the essay. She says, and I quote, "The problem is that they, that is black women, can receive protection only to the extent that their experiences are recognizably similar to those whose experiences tend to be reflected in anti-discrimination doctrine," unquote. Now, over here, what is she talking about? She is actually trying to, tell us that what is this disadvantaged position of the black women in the anti-discrimination law. She says that a black woman can receive protection only to the extent, that is, when her experience, when her position, when her issue is recognizably similar to the issues or experiences which are reflected in the anti-discrimination doctrine. Okay? And just before this, she makes this point that how the anti-discrimination doctrine is based on privilege, which means that it factors in, or it is based on, the experience of either the white woman or a privileged black man, right? So this being the standard then, against which a black woman's experience is, evaluated. So that's what she's saying, that a black woman's experience is unique. And when that uniqueness does not coincide or only tangentially coincides with the already established understanding of discrimination in the anti-discrimination law, that is when the black woman stands to be at a disadvantage. She does not, so there are no provisions to protect a black woman, because the provisions which are there in place are based on the experience either of a black woman or a privileged black man. That is a very important point that Crenshaw makes. The next important intervention that she makes in the essay is that she critiques white feminism. Now, of course, we've been talking about feminism in the previous lectures as well. Now, what do we mean by white feminism? It means that when the feminists who are writing about the question of women, they themselves are from, the privileged race, that is, they belong to the generation of the whites, right? So, feminists who are white, how does their position, make a difference to this school of thought? What are the gaps in their understanding? That's something that Crenshaw draws our attention to. And hence we say that her essay is a critique of white feminism. Now, what is she, what is the point of her critique? Let's look at this quote. She says, "Not only are women of color, in fact, overlooked, but their exclusion is reinforced when white women speak for and as women," unquote. Now, over here, she is, talking about the idea of white feminism and how it operates. Now, she says that in the theory of feminism advanced by the white feminists, the questions of women of color are overlooked. That is the first point that she makes. But then she says that not only is there an obscuring of their experience or this kind of an exclusion, but instead she says that this exclusion is further reinforced when these white women speak for and as women. What is Crenshaw trying to say here? She says that the positions or the arguments made by the white women, about the condition of women in society, about what should be done to improve their condition, what are the questions that, that concern women in society. She says that when white women talk about these questions, they speak for and they speak as women. So which means that there is a kind of a homogenization in their discourse as well. Homogenization how? Where they fail to look at the fact that how women, differ in their experiences when they belong to different social categories. And one such social category is that of race. that a woman who's black, her issues and concerns will be different from the one who is white. Very clearly, the one who is white is in a relative position of, a privilege. But this distinction is overlooked in the feminist theory. And she says that how the white women then speak for and they speak as women. So this is this kind of a homogenization, this kind of a universalizing, argument that is given by the white feminists is a point of discomfort for Crenshaw. From here, she goes on to mention about the different conditions of black women and how their conditions or their position is different from the conventional patriarchal discourse. So, of course, so far she has established this kind of a difference. She has talked about the unique position. Now, next in the essay, she talks about that what is this uniqueness, right? What is the particular difference that a black woman's subjectivity has? In the context, there's this important reference from the essay, and let's look at that. She says, the role of black women in the family and in other black institutions does not always resemble the familiar manifestations of patriarchy in the white community, unquote. What is she saying? She says that when we look at a black woman, either in a family setup or in any other institution, social institution or a political institution, a position or a role or the part played by a black woman, it does not resemble the part played by a white woman, and also it, the way patriarchy, the way this kind of a male domination exists in the white community does not parallel how it exists in the black community. Which means what? That the way white women are subjugated, what their experience is not similar to how a black woman is treated in her community. So this is the beginning point of a difference. So even within the patriarchal discourse then, there is this kind of distinction. Okay? That how the discrimination unfolds differently. There are different conditions or there are different questions that come up vis-a-vis discrimination of the white women and the prejudice practiced against the black women. Now, what is this difference, or how does patriarchy manifest differently? She gives one example. She says that, a lot of feminist theory, feminist school of thought has talked about the importance of women going outside of homes and working, right? The importance of economic independence, the importance of women not just remaining, kind of restricted to the domestic sphere alone, but also, equally contributing in the labor done outside. Okay. Now, this is Crenshaw. This, according to Crenshaw, is one of the arguments advanced by the white feminists. Now, this is very, very different from the position of women, from the position of black women. She says black women have traditionally worked outside the homes already. So what does it mean? That when we talk about subjugation of black women, then this question that they need to go out or they need to be given opportunities for working outside of the domestic sphere, it does not hold good for black women. Because according to their culture, because according to how they've lived their life, they have traditionally worked outside their homes all their lives. So this entire idea of economic independence, this entire idea of transcending the domestic sphere is, it kind of remains limited to just the white women alone. And therefore, she goes on to, tell us that how all of this needs to be factored in when we look at the unique position of the black woman and while building a theory to address her question as well. Next, she goes on to talk about the different position of black women vis-a-vis conditions of sexual violence. So first, she gives an instance of how the conditions of work are very different. The question of domesticity is very different for a white woman and a black woman. Likewise, even the experience of sexual violence or the question of sexual violence occurs or emerges differently when we talk about it in the context of the black woman. Now, let's look at this quote. She says, "The singular focus on rape as a manifestation of male power over female sexuality tends to eclipse the use of rape as a weapon of racial terror. When black women were raped by white males, they were being raped not as women generally, but as black women specifically." Unquote. So over here she's talking about the idea of sexual violence, that how when violence is done to a black woman, over there the existing understanding, in fact she first talks about the existing conditions of sexual violence, and she says that in the questions of sexual violence against women, they just factor in the idea of gender, but they do not factor in the aspect that when a black woman is violated by a white man, both the concerns come into consideration: A, that she is black, and B, she is a woman. So that's what. So she is in a way, doubly disadvantaged, and this kind of a double disadvantage then is eclipsed when they talk about the idea of sexual violence, right? And the other important point that she makes is that when we look at this unique position of the black woman, it helps us understand that how a lot of times sexual violence in the case of a black woman becomes then a weapon of racial terror as well. That how she is discriminated against along the lines of race by means of this kind of sexual violence which is done to her. So again we see what? The coming together of two issues as pointed out by Crenshaw. Okay, so that's how we see that the point that Crenshaw makes is that she at length talks about this kind of a different position of black women vis-a-vis their conditions with respect to sexual violence and their condition with respect to work. And of course there are other aspects also that she discusses in the essay, but these two seem to stand out. Now if we also further look at if we look still closely at the idea of sexual violence as a weapon of racial terror, what brings to mind over here are the slave narratives as well, right? Now if you look at narratives that talk about slavery, there's this very popular autobiography by Frederick Douglass. Over there he talks about how the African Americans were enslaved, and the position that these African American women had as a slave, and how that position was different from that of a male African American slave. A lot of times, so now at the crux of that kind of a racial violence would be that how they would be made to work in unhealthy conditions. They would be made to slog under inhuman conditions, etc. Right? So that was, of course, one of the, and they would be underfed. There would be no sense of dignity given to them. There would be no sense of basic, human rights in the case of a slave, etc. All these questions were there. But when it came to the experience of an African woman as a slave, this idea of sexual violence was added to that, where the white man did not just exploit the slave, for work, for labor, making them or maybe treating them as almost subhuman entities. But the black women then were also sexually violated. So a lot of slave narratives, as I said, carry this understanding. And Crenshaw, in this essay, seems to again talk about this, and she seems to highlight the need for developing a framework that factors in this kind of a different position of black women. Now, if we finally come to the crux of Crenshaw's contention, what is that? There's a very important excerpt from the essay. It's again a slightly longish one, but this excerpt carries, the crux of what Crenshaw says. So let's look at it. She says it is somewhat ironic that those concerned with alleviating the ills of racism and sexism should adopt such a top-down approach to discrimination. If their efforts instead began with addressing the needs and problems of those who are most disadvantaged, and with restructuring and remaking the world where necessary, then others who are singularly disadvantaged would also benefit, unquote. Now, this seems to be the crux of Crenshaw's contention. What is she trying to say here? First, she is trying to question those discourses or the anti-discrimination or the feminist understanding, which all these concepts or all these ideas or in fact, for that sense, all these approaches, according to Crenshaw, have a top-down approach to discrimination. What do we mean by top-down approach? That they'll first look at the most privileged person in hierarchy. Remember, we were talking about the idea of privilege and how feminism focuses on a white woman's experience as the woman's experience, right? So there is this top-down approach. There is a white woman's experience that will first be talked about. It's the privileged black experience that will first be talked about. So she says that it is quite ironic that how these discourses are meant to hit at the roots of prejudice, but they themselves seem to adopt this kind of a top-down approach. Then she says that what is the need? What is or where is now the revision? So after she has talked at length about the problem, the gaps in the existing theoretical frameworks, she now seems to give us some idea of where do we or what kind of a revision is needed. She says that the efforts of these theories, of these laws or these discourses should instead begin by addressing the needs and problems of those who are the most disadvantaged. So instead of beginning with the privileged, their first concern should be with those who are the most disadvantaged. Most disadvantaged means what? That those individuals in whom multiple marginalities seem to coincide. Okay? So if these ideas or these discourses begin with the needs or begin by focusing on the needs and problems of those who are the most disadvantaged, then they will automatically benefit the cause of those who are, as she says, singularly disadvantaged. So it's almost like if the starting rubric is a broad one, which includes the question of multiple marginalities, which includes the conditions of people with different minority positions. If that becomes the focus of these frameworks, then she says it's going to be automatically beneficial for those individuals in society also who are just singularly disadvantaged. For instance, the white women, as she mentions in the essay. So that forms the crux of the intervention that Crenshaw is making. So she says that we need to restructure, remake, the existing frameworks along these lines in order to include these multiple marginalities. She talks about questioning the single axis framework of analysis. She talks about the unique position of the black women. She talks about the differences of their questions and their experience vis-a-vis white women. And through all of this, she establishes thereby the need for an intersectional approach to questions of gender, race, and other marginality. Now, these are some of the important points that she makes in this 1989 essay. She's also talked about this concept in other essays as well, but this one is where she talked about the idea of intersectionality for the first time. So Crenshaw's contribution then, to reiterate, becomes that she broadens the frontiers or the limits of feminism and anti-race discourse. Thank you.